just get started here because I've always believed, and my dad always taught me that if you're on time, you're late. So so we're gonna do this.
Great.
Welcome everyone to Ollie at the University of South Dakota. We've got people from all over today. I see people from all different towns. And of course, we've got our speaker from far, far away. So I just wanted to remind everybody, if you're in town or coming this way, we do have our Ollie book sale this week. It started this morning and goes until 4. It'll be 9 to 4 tomorrow and 9 to 12 on Friday. Oh, and there's another kitty. Goodness. Um, so please come to our book sale and support Ollie. It's one of our biggest fundraisers of the year. So thank you everyone for joining us. And Irv, I am so glad to have you back. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. This is my third time presenting for Ollie at University of South Dakota, and I feel honored and fortunate to have this opportunity to share with you. My presentation is primarily about my mother and her experiences during the Holocaust, as she wrote about those experiences in a book that I published in 2019. And I want to begin today by sharing a PowerPoint presentation to introduce you to my mother, to explain to you how it came to be that I inherited and then published her stories. I will, in the first half of today's presentation, it'll be about introducing you to her, giving you some sense of what went into the book and how it came to fruition. And in the second half, I'll be sharing excerpts from the book. And along the way, I'll also be taking your questions, your insights, whatever it is you'd like to share. I do look forward to hearing from you. So I'm going to share my screen now. And when I do this, I do it from my iPad, which is sitting next to my computer. So it takes me about 10 seconds to switch over. And I just keep talking, hopefully, so you don't get bored. So hopefully you're now seeing the first of my slides. I'm seeing it, but I'm also seeing a few faces going down the right side of my screen, covering a portion of it. So I'm going to minimize that and I won't see your faces. And if your screen is blocked to any degree, you can probably minimize that as well. So this presentation is, the book that I published is titled Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust. And I subtitled the presentation, My Mother and the Holocaust Brought to Light. In the way of introducing myself, I am Irving Lubliner. I'm an emeritus professor at Southern Oregon University, but out of the 40 years that I spent in the classroom formally teaching, the kind of teaching where you're grading papers and evaluating students as opposed to Ollie, I did that for 40 years, only 9 of them at the university level. Prior to that, I was for many years a kindergarten through 8th grade mathematics specialist. And at the university, I was training the next generation of teachers who will be teaching mathematics in their classrooms. Mostly I was working with elementary teachers, some of them very fearful of math, and it was my job to help them combat that fear and become proficient in the math that they were going to teach. I also had a consulting practice going around the country and speaking to other teachers who were teaching mathematics, trying to share with them activities that I felt were effective in the classroom. Only when I retired from the university did I publish my mother's writings. I'll tell you more about that process. I created my own publishing company called Falabra Press. And in the bottom right, you see the website, onlyhopebook.com, where there are a number of recorded presentations like the one I'm giving today. So if you know somebody who you think would appreciate seeing a presentation like this, please direct them to onlyhopebook.com. There are also excerpts from the book, testimonial comments about it, radio interviews that aired on our local NPR radio station, and a number of other things, including a contact link you can use to contact me directly. I want to thank you for carving out this time to spend with me. I know that you have other things you could have done this afternoon. I really appreciate that you've decided to spend a couple of hours with me. This is my mother, Felicia Bornstein Lubliner. And This picture was taken in 1974, 50 years ago, just months before she passed away. She died of lung cancer, and it moved very, very quickly. So she may look healthy here, but this was probably 6 months or so before she passed away. April of 74 was when she died. But in the weeks leading up to her death, she asked me to provide her with a tape recorder so that she could record a message for me and for others in the family. And in that recording, she said, "What am I going to leave behind? How long will I be remembered? How long? For as long as one is remembered, one is not dead." I believe that. You can live in people's minds, memories, and hearts. I believe that. And this presentation is sort of a testimonial to her perseverance, her indomitable spirit, and will explain to you why she does indeed live on in people's minds, memories, and hearts 50 years after she died. Here you see her at age 16 or perhaps a young 17. I know she's not older than 17 because her father's in this picture. And her father was taken away from the family when she was a young 17. So the fact that he is still in the photograph, as well as an older sister who was also taken away, the fact that the family is together tells me she can't be older than 17, and she looks like she's at least 16. So I'm kind of doing my best to guess when this picture was taken. If you arrived at a concentration camp in Nazi Germany and you had precious photos that you had hopes of holding on to, you'd be told, leave your belongings here, you'll get them back shortly, and then you'd never see those belongings again. So the only reason I have this photograph is that my mother had an aunt who lived in Oakland, California, and this photograph was sent out of Europe to California, and my aunt years later provided me with this, the only picture I have of my mother's family. I never met my mother, by the way, is the one survivor of this family. Everybody else you see here was murdered. So that would include my grandparents, who of course I never met, my great grandmother, and everybody else in this photograph would have been an uncle or an aunt to me if they had lived, a brother or sister to my mother. Take a note of those two faces, please, because in another photograph I'll show you soon, I believe, and I'm nearly positive that I've spotted those two people, my mother and her older brother. Britannica.com defines the word Holocaust as the systematic state-sponsored killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. I showed this slide to a group of middle school students the other day, and there were two things I tried to impress upon them. One is that we're not talking about ancient history. Most of them, when I asked, how many of you know somebody at least 80 years old? Most of them raised their hands. Maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's a neighbor, but most of them said they knew somebody at least 80 years old. And I tried to impress upon them that if we go back 80 years, that's when all of this was going on. So the span of one lifetime. And also I tried to impress upon them just what a large number 6 million is. And I asked them, well, if we killed off everybody here in Oregon, would that be 6 million people? And it turns out, no, we'd only be about 70% of the way there. If we killed everybody in Oregon and West Virginia, we'd be really close, but not quite at 6 million people. So it's a large number of people. And my mother does tell her stories from the perspective of a Jew growing up in Poland. But I want to acknowledge some of those other groups that suffered and in many cases lost their lives. They included people with disabilities, either physical or mental. Here you see a poster that was used to garner support for cutting off support for anybody with a disability. And it reads, this person who suffers a hereditary disease has a lifelong cost of 60,000 Reichsmarks to the national community. Comrade, that is your money too. So this was to get people in line with a new policy that would say, if you have a disability, we're not going to spend any money on supporting you. The Roma and Sinti people, perhaps because of the color of their skin, perhaps because of their customs, they were seen as foreign and persecuted. Political opponents of the Nazi regime, if you spoke out against what the regime was doing, it's likely you'd be rounded up and taken away. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to swear allegiance to Hitler. Homosexuals and people of color or mixed race were persecuted. The Freemasons were another group that refused to swear allegiance. And anybody who tried to protect those being subjected to persecution. If you knew somebody who was in one of these groups, or perhaps Jewish, and you decided that you were going to protect that person by hiding him or her in your attic or in your basement, the downside was that if you were caught, you were going to be shot in the town square along with the person you tried to hide. Your family members would also be shot or hung, perhaps. And they wouldn't stop there. They would round up neighbors. They would round up people in your vicinity that didn't even know you, and maybe kill 50 people for what you did. And I refer to this as the punishment of many for the deeds of one. And this was a very effective way of keeping people in line. So you might have friends or family members saying, please do not hide somebody in your attic or your basement. If you get caught, we might suffer. And these public hangings and shootings were all too common. Now, as I said, my mother does tell her stories from the perspective of a Jew growing up in Poland. Things became very difficult for all the Polish people with this invading Nazi army coming into their country. But the propaganda was telling Poles, if you don't like your circumstance, if you think the quality of your life has diminished, we've got just the group for you to blame the Jews. And you will notice the Jews on the street because we are forcing them to wear a yellow star. Once they reach a certain age, they have to wear this distinguishing yellow star on their clothing. So you'll recognize them. And the yellow star gives you license to treat them as subhuman, treat them as animals. We no longer let them walk on the sidewalk, only in the gutter, and we've taken away a lot of other privileges, and we encourage you to mistreat these people and not even treat them as people. So among the things that Jews had to endure were random attacks. They were barred from a variety of professions. They were expelled from the schools. They were banned from parks, restaurants, swimming pools, and the like. They were not allowed freedom of movement. You could not own or drive a car. You could not own or ride a bicycle. You couldn't ride the trains. You couldn't ride the buses. So if you needed to get from point A to point B, really, you had to walk. And if you needed to deliver something to point B, you'd have to just carry it with you, or perhaps twist somebody else's arm and get them to take it in their car for you. They were evicted from their homes without reason or notice. They were forced to forfeit valuable items. The radio played a special role because you might not want to forfeit your radio. It was your way of getting information about what was going on in the world and in the war. So you might say, I'm going to hold on to my radio. I'll only play it late at night at really low volume so I'll know what's going on in the world. The downside was if you were caught, it was going to be the punishment of many for the deeds of one. So friends and family members might tell you, turn in your radio. It's not worth the risk. If you get caught, we're going to suffer. Very effective. There was no protection in courts of law. The laws were written so that one human being could sue another human being if they were wronged. But if you've lost your status as a human being and you're now treated as an animal, you have no rights to sue any longer. They were subjected to strict curfews. They were banned from shopping in stores owned by non-Jews. And if you went to a store owned by a fellow Jew, it's likely that the storekeeper would tell you, I would sell you things if I could get them, but nobody's willing to sell to me any longer. So your family and my family are going to have to turn to the black market where things are very, very expensive. And people were having to sell off their jewelry, their cookware, their dishes, their books, whatever they had that had value, they had to start selling it off just to get the money to buy things on the black market they needed from one day to the next. They were forced to append either Sarah or Israel to their names as a middle name on all their documents, which was a way of just letting anybody know if they were looking at that document or perhaps a request made to the government that this request is coming from a Jew. And of course, that request would be turned down. They were unable to access their frozen bank accounts. So, taking your money and going elsewhere was just not an option. And here you see a partial list. It really went on from there. And people had to wonder, could it possibly get any worse? And unfortunately, in time, it gets much worse. This is the little town of Pabianice, where my mother grew up, very centrally located in Poland. And my father was nearby in the town of Lodz. In Polish, the capital L has a slash through it and is pronounced as a W. So a Pole would refer to this town as Łódź. So my parents grew up very near each other. They did not know each other. They met after the war. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies established more than 44,000 places where they could lock you up, and that included ghettos. Now, in the context of today's youth culture, the word ghetto might just be used to refer in slang terms to as referring to somebody's clothing, perhaps. Oh, the way you're dressed is so ghetto, or the poor part of town might be called the ghetto. But in the context of the Holocaust, ghetto probably meant, depending on which ghetto it was, it probably meant you were behind barbed wire, you're living in a building that might be designed for one or two families, and now you've got maybe a dozen families living within it. Your whole family might not even have its own room. You might be sharing a single room with another family. You're sleeping on the floor because there are no beds. You may have running water, but maybe not. You may have electricity or maybe not. It really varied ghetto to ghetto, but you can bet that the life in any ghetto was very, very uncomfortable. And again, people are wondering, can it get any worse? And unfortunately, in time, it does. Eventually, they closed the ghetto in Pabianica and marched everybody at gunpoint to a train station. They had no idea where they were going to be taken. It turns out they were going to be taken on a very short train ride to the Lodz ghetto, which was already drastically overcrowded. When they initially locked the gates on this fenced, barbed wired ghetto in Lodz, there were 164,000 people crammed into 1.5 square miles. And that translates to roughly the same density as today's Manila in the Philippines, which is the most densely populated city in the world. But I recently went online to look at a picture of Manila, and I see buildings that are 60, 70, 80 stories high, housing all of these people. In Lodz, the highest buildings might be 3 stories, maybe 4 stories. And so you've got just a tremendous concentration of people, drastically overcrowded. And then they move even more people in from the Pabianica ghetto. And I tried to find a photograph of my mother's ghetto, and I couldn't, but I found this photograph of the day they closed it and marched everybody to the train station. People are carrying what they own, and you can see that nobody has very much. They were limited when they were put into the ghetto initially to a certain number of kilograms or pounds that they could take with them. And so people, in some cases, took food with them. And now if that food has been eaten, they're leaving with even less than they came in with. In some cases, they may have had to sell off certain things that they wanted to hold on to, but their supplies, their possessions have diminished as time goes by. So people are walking out of the ghetto with everything they own. And quite to my surprise, when I found this photograph online, I spotted my mother and her older brother. And those are the 2 pictures I showed you earlier of those 2 people. And I'm 99.9% sure I've spotted them in that photograph, much to my surprise. Eventually, my parents were both sent to Auschwitz, not on the same day. They still didn't know each other, but they were again in the same place at the same time, both of them in Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz is by far the most well-known of all the concentration camps, and I want to say a few words about why that is. There were some camps that served no purpose whatsoever but to kill people. And if you were sent to one of these camps, it's likely you'd be taken and put into a excuse me, I thought I was a little mixed up about what the next slide was. You'd be put into a truck. You get off a train, be pushed into a truck. The truck would take you out to the countryside. They would line you up around a huge pit or make you dig the pit yourself. And then they would go down the line and shoot each person. Bodies fall into the pit. Eventually, they realized this is inefficient, so they equipped the trucks with tubing to take exhaust fumes and pump them in the back where the people were, and then people choked because of the fumes The asphyxiation killed people. So by the time they got out to the countryside, the trucks would just unload dead bodies and then return to get the next group of people. And this was going on day and night, day after day after day. You can see the huge number of people killed in these camps. At Treblinka alone, 925,000. Now, Auschwitz was for many an extermination camp. 1.1 million people were killed there, and that's 85% of those sent there. But if 85% died, that means 15% lived, and that included both my mother and my father. My father would never speak about his experiences. He never wrote about his experiences. I know very little about what he experienced. My mother, on the other hand, did speak to groups as a public speaker. She wrote about her experiences. If you met her, you would have never guessed that she was a Holocaust survivor. She was effervescent. She had a smile on her face. She was the life of the party. She loved to laugh. She loved a good joke. But in certain situations where she knew she had an audience that was interested in learning about the Holocaust, she was very forthcoming with information about it. Not only was Auschwitz an extermination camp for so many, but it was also a place where people were forced to do labor to support the German war effort. And in some cases, people just had to wait there and ultimately be sent somewhere else where it was deemed that their slave labor was needed. Both my parents did assigned labor at Auschwitz, but were ultimately sent elsewhere. My mother to a camp called Gross-Rosen, where the conditions were terrible, but not quite as bad as Auschwitz. And my father was sent to an absolute hell in Bergen-Belsen, which was in Germany. Since I know so little about my father's experience and relatively, I know little about my mother's for that matter, but because I know so little about my dad, I had to do some research to find out what was it like at Bergen-Belsen, and I found that the British soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen erected this sign telling people that when they came into this camp, they found 10,000 unburied dead bodies. And then they found another 13,000 so close to death that they could not be revived and ultimately died in the weeks and months that followed, even though the British set up hospitals to try to revive people. I weigh close to 180 pounds, and my father, when he was found there, weighed 80 pounds, 100 pounds less than I do now. I just can't imagine going on a diet and losing 100 pounds. He required multiple surgeries, but he did survive and lived a number of years. The British soldiers were accompanied by Richard Dimbleby of the BBC, and he wrote, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful, ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." And when you have people dying in such great numbers, there's no way to give them a fitting burial. And instead, you just have to do mass burials like you see here. This is so different than if we today go visit a cemetery and we look at gravestones that might say beloved mother of such and such, or beloved father of, or perhaps served in the US Marine Corps or something like that. Here, there's no reference to who these people are, who their relatives were, who their beloved family members were. It's just so impersonal, and it's a shame, and it's heartbreaking to know that there are places on earth today where people are dying in such great numbers that they have to be buried this way. This is the sign at the entrance to Auschwitz reading Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. And this was just part of a grand deception. People would get off a train, they would see this sign, they would hear a band playing, and they would think, well, if work sets us free, that means we're going to have to do forced labor here, and that's bad. But at least they're going to feed us and clothe us and house us. And for many, this sign was one of the last things they ever saw. They would be told, you're going to go take a shower now. And in my mother's case, it was really a shower. In my father's case, it was really a shower. But for so many, that shower turned out to be a gas chamber. Whether you went to the left or to the right, whether you went to life or to death, probably depended on just how healthy you looked as a slave laborer. And people were already so weak from their ghetto experience, wherever they had come from, that many were put to death just instantly. They were deemed not worth keeping alive. My mother describes many things in Auschwitz happening in groups of 5, including sleeping. I tried to find a photograph of 5 women sleeping in a bunk, and all I could find was 3. There just aren't that many photographs taken inside the barracks of Auschwitz. But even if it is just 3 women sharing a bunk, imagine the discomfort. Underneath you, wood, no mattress, just wooden slats. Above you, maybe a blanket, but if there is a blanket, you're sharing it with the others sharing that compartment with you. If one person has to scratch an itch and moves, everybody's got to move to accommodate that itch scratching movement. If somebody has a disease, you can imagine how rapidly it's going to spread in a barracks like this. Before sunrise, people are awakened. If they happen to be asleep, somebody barges in and says, everybody outside, get into your groups of 5. So they go outside, they get into groups of 5. If they're told to kneel in the mud, then they kneel in the mud. If they're told to keep their hands over their head, they do their best to keep their hands over their head, because they're going to be there for hours. It takes hours to count thousands of people, and they're going to be counted by 5s. If you happen to die overnight of disease or malnutrition, or you froze to death, your dead body is brought outside and heaped together with 4 others, because even the dead are counted in groups of 5. If you don't have the strength to keep your hands over your head, when you're told to keep them there, somebody will come from behind you and beat you, making an example out of you, so that everybody else sees that they better keep their hands over their head as they were told. Another thing that happened in 5s, as my mother describes it, is the daily feeding. You might be handed a tiny loaf of bread, and you're told that is for 5 of you, and you have no knife to cut it. So with your fingers, you are ripping it into 5, what you hope are equal pieces, and giving it to your group mates. You might be handed a bucket of soup. It's sandy, it's watery, it's got very little nutrition in it, but you need whatever you can get from it that will keep you alive. So you're entitled to 5 gulps from the bucket, and then you pass it to the next woman, and she will take her 5 gulps, and it makes its way around the circle of 5. And when you're taking your 5 gulps, the other 4 people are staring at you, because they know that if you take an extra gulp, that's 1 less gulp for them. So everybody is watching very carefully what the others are doing, hoping to get every drop they are entitled to. I've had people who've read my mother's book say they'll never think of the number 5 quite the same as they do now. This is my mother about 7 months after she was liberated. She was liberated in May of 1945, and this is December of 1945. So it looks like she's been nourished and looks like she's in pretty good health. This looks like a still photograph, but it's actually one frame from this Academy Award winning movie. It's The Long Way Home, narrated by Morgan Freeman, and it won the Best Documentary Oscar in 1997. It describes the circumstance of people who, having been liberated from the camps and knowing that it was not safe to go back to their community. In many cases, there would be lynchings, or people would get off a train and be shot because they were not trusted. They were deemed as, well, they're coming back to claim their property. We don't want to give up the property that we've inherited from them. And so it was, in many cases, unsafe to go back to your city or village. So refugee camps were set up to deal with people who needed a place to live. And it's well known that these camps existed through the 1940s. What isn't so well known is that even into the late 1950s, we still had people living in refugee camps from World War II. It's very much like the situation today, where people are appealing to countries around the world, please give us a visa so we can come and create a new life for ourselves in your country. So about 10 minutes before the end of this movie, my mother is on the screen for 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she blinks. So I contacted the filmmaker and said, you've got 2 seconds of movie footage of my mother. Can I get the rest of that footage? And the filmmaker said, we only had 1 second of footage of your mother. We showed it in slow motion so that it would last 2 seconds. And we wanted to include her because we felt her eyes conveyed the grief and loss of the past, but a hope for a better future. And my mother definitely created for herself and for me and for my older brother a better future. I mean, she really did make the most of her life. Southern Oregon University, where I retired from the university a few years ago, has an annual theme where they have a number of campus programs related to that theme each year. This year's theme is flourishing. And they asked me, and this took place about a month ago, to do a presentation called Flourishing After the Holocaust. And that really describes my mother. She flourished. My mother had lost 8 siblings and her parents. My father lost his parents, but he had an older brother. And his older brother, David, survived, though David's wife did not, and David's daughter did not. But David survived and was in relatively good health. So he went to the Red Cross and made an inquiry and found out that his brother, Abram, was alive. So he traveled to where my father was in a hospital near Bergen-Belsen. And he presented himself there and said, I'm here to see my brother, Abram Lubliner. And they pointed to my dad, and he looked at the man and said, no, that's not him. I guess I wasted my time coming here. And they said, well, why don't you go talk to him? Maybe that really is your brother and you don't recognize him. And they were right. That's what happened. My uncle did not recognize his brother. My dad did not recognize his brother. The two of them stared at each other without any recognition. And it wasn't until they started talking to each other that they realized that they were brothers. David got engaged to remarry, and his fiance met my father and said, I'm from the little town of Pabianica, and I know another woman from Pabianica named Felicia. We nicknamed her Fella, and I want to introduce you to Fella. I think you would enjoy meeting her. So she played matchmaker and brought my parents together. They fell in love and got married in a refugee camp. And it turns out my father and his brother both married women from Pabianica who had known each other as children. These are my parents and my older brother, Joseph, coming over from Europe to the US. They got off this boat in New Orleans and made their way to Oakland, California, probably using a train or bus ticket provided by my mother's aunt, who said, if you can get a visa to come to the US, do so, come to Oakland, I'll help you make a new start. And that's what they did. My mother died at age 51, 50 years ago in 1974 of lung cancer. My father was diagnosed almost immediately after her death with early onset Alzheimer's, and he died 6 years later in 1980 of Alzheimer's disease. And my older brother died in 1982 of an aortic aneurysm. I mentioned their deaths not because I'm seeking your sympathy, but because A, I miss them, and B, they might make little corrections to what I'm saying to you, because all I can do is do my best to recall things accurately, and they might have little corrections here and there and say, well, it wasn't quite like that, and they would correct me. My parents were determined that Joseph and I would get the most normal American kid upbringing that my parents could provide for us. Our upbringing included music lessons, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, activities at the local recreation department, Little League Baseball, the things that American kids do. My parents would switch into speaking Polish or Yiddish when they didn't want us to understand, but there was no effort to get us to speak European languages. There was an effort to get us to learn Hebrew for our bar mitzvahs. We did have a Jewish upbringing, but they did not want us to think of ourselves as a European family any longer. They really wanted us to fit in and be Americans. And we were not talking about the Holocaust. If I ask questions, I might ask, Mom and Dad, why do you both have a tattooed number on your arm? They would explain to me, oh, we were prisoners during the war and our captors tattooed us and we were known by these numbers. Oh, well, why don't I have grandparents? Well, your grandparents died during the war. Oh. And every time I would ask these questions, I would get short answers, and I could sense that they were grieving as they responded to me. And so my tendency was just say, I think they don't like answering these questions. It seems to make them very sad. So I stopped asking. They didn't share much with me, probably because they didn't want to scare me. So I learned so little about their experience during the Holocaust. Every year I would see them light a memorial candle, as is the Jewish tradition, and say prayers in Hebrew, but I was never learning the names of the loved ones who were being memorialized in this way. I didn't know the names of my grandparents or what my grandparents did for a living. I didn't know that my mother had lost 8 siblings. It just seemed to be sort of a group grieving process for all those who were lost. I did have some awareness that my mother was speaking about her experiences during World War II. She would mention at the dinner table that she had gone to San Francisco State and spoken. Um, and she was doing this when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. And I would rather be outside playing baseball and just goofing off with my friends than hearing her talk to me about what she was telling these college students at San Francisco State. But I did have some awareness that the theme of her presentations was the Holocaust. I got that sense because I would hear the typewriter late at night, and I would come downstairs and I would see that she was typing stories about the Holocaust. What I had no idea of is the quality. I now have an idea, but at the time I had no idea of the fine quality of what she was writing in a language she didn't even know in 1949. Within 12 years, 1961, I'm 8 years old, I'm not paying attention, and she gets one of her stories written in English in the San Francisco Chronicle's Sunday supplement. And so this is the shortest of the stories that went into the compilation that I ultimately created and published years later. And she was an amazing writer, and just she really knew how to craft a short story. But we weren't talking about the experience. Meanwhile, I'm in school and my mother's in school. I didn't realize it. I found this piece of paper among her belongings when she died, and it indicates that she was going to the community college to study writing. I had no sense of this. In November of 1961, I'm 9 years old. I don't care what mom is doing. I'd rather be playing with my friends. Now, one memory I do have of that same period is that in my elementary school, there was an annual talent show. And my father would be a good sport and say, I'm willing to be in the talent show. Just put me in a skit with other parents and don't give me many spoken lines because I don't feel that confident with my English. My mother would say, just give me a time slot. I'll get up there by myself. I'll write a monologue and I'll make people laugh. And that's exactly what she did. I still have the program from when I was in 6th grade for the talent show. And she's the only solo act in the whole talent show. She was amazing. She was just a force to be reckoned with. She would get up there and just make people laugh. And it was the highlight of the show. And I think she did this when I was in 4th grade and 5th grade and 6th grade, always doing it solo. I was so proud of her. She was a seamstress during my younger years when I needed her there. When I came home from school, she would be measuring people and making them custom made clothing with little labels that said fashions by Felicia. But she wanted a bigger life. She wanted to see the world. So she became a travel agent. I have pictures of her all over the world, climbing the steps of the Parthenon, lounging on a beach in Mazatlan, riding a camel in the desert, sitting next to the captain on a cruise boat. As a travel agent, she owed it to her clients to kind of learn about the destinations they were traveling to. But her specialty was Israel, and she booked more travel to Israel than any other Northern California travel agent, eventually leading tours herself, taking people under her supervision to tour Israel. That smile that you see there was always on her face. You would have never guessed that she suffered from insomnia, that she probably got very little sleep the night before. This was so well masked by that smile that was just always on her face. She was effervescent. She loved a good joke, whether she was telling it or listening to it. She was the life of the party. On the other side of the photograph is her friend Rena. Rena would come over a few nights a week and they would play Scrabble. And I challenged them when I was about 20 years old, knowing that for me, English was a first language, not so for them. And I said, come on, let's play Scrabble. And I came in third. which really was a testament to just how vast my mother's vocabulary was by then. Here she is shortly before she passed away in 1974. And that would have been the opportunity to say, Mom, you've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Before you die, I need you to tell me about the Holocaust. But she was in so much pain from her cancer. I didn't want to bring up a subject I knew was going to add additional pain and discomfort emotionally for her. So I let it go. And I regret that I did so because I learned so little about her experience. After she died and my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I hired somebody to care for him in home so that I could finish graduate school. And then I moved in with him and tried to care for him. And it was then that I found her typewritten stories. Here you see 3 of them, and also this handwritten essay titled Follow Me into Auschwitz. And you can see, if you look carefully, that it's got words crossed out and other words inserted. It was a work in progress, but even in that crude form, it was a masterpiece. And I felt it deserved to go into the book. So it serves as an introduction to the stories that she crafted, for which I found multiple drafts that she had worked on and revised and really crossed every T and dotted every I and made sure that she was saying what she wanted to say. I also inherited recordings of her speaking at San Francisco State. And that means I can play you her voice shortly, and I will do so. I started sharing what she left for me in school classrooms. And often teachers would tell the parents, we're going to have a special guest speaking to the students on such and such day. And if you, the parents, would like to come hear him, you're welcome. And so often I was speaking to teachers and parents and students, and all 3 of those groups were telling me the same message. You can't just sit on these stories. You must publish them. They are too powerful just to be shared in a school classroom here in the San Francisco Bay Area. These need to find a bigger audience, a national audience, maybe an international audience. These are too powerful. Share them. And so that became a goal of mine 30 years ago, 35 years ago. I don't really recall when this all began, but I wanted over the years to say something. If I did publish a book, I wanted to say something about how I've been impacted by my parents' experience as Holocaust survivors. And I tried over the years to write something, and it never suited me. I never felt comfortable with it. It paled in comparison, quality-wise, to what my mother had written in a language that was probably her 4th or 5th language. And here I am writing in my only language, and I just can't seem to find the words. In 2014, I retired, and my wife and I were talking about what's left to do in our life that's truly important. And I realized for me, what is important is to publish my mother's stories. So I hired a writing coach to help me. The writing coach gave me some prompts and said, why don't you start a paragraph with these words and see where it takes you? And I would do my best to follow the instructions I was receiving. And ultimately, the writing coach said, okay, let's see what you've got. And I passed on everything to him that I had written in the past and everything that I had written in response to these prompts. And he helped me sort it out and decide what is worth putting in the book, what's not worth putting in the book. And most of what I wrote never did make it into the book, but it was very therapeutic for me to write it. And eventually I felt ready to create a publishing company in honor of my mother, whose nickname was Fela, and my father, Abram. I named my publishing company Falabra, and that name was chosen to honor them. Falabra Press has just one publication. It is this book, Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust. I do consider it to be my mother's book. I contributed the foreword, the afterword, and I served as editor, but not because my mother's writing needed editing, but somebody had to make editorial decisions about how to organize the book, in what order the stories should appear, where would I insert a little note from her son to let something be clarified, what would this cover look like, what would the interior font look like. I made decisions that an editor would make, but her writing was really flawless and did not need anybody to step in and edit it. She would have been delighted to know that 2 years ago in May, her book had become in the Kindle store #1 in history short reads, #1 in biography and memoir short reads, and #8 in teen and young adult biography ebooks. She would have been so pleased to know this. And they say if you ever reach #1 in some category, you get to refer to your book as a bestseller. So my mother is a best-selling author, as you can see. I'm delighted, and she would have been delighted to know how many teens and young adults have taken an interest in what she wrote. So here she is, one more image of her. And let me just pause here and see if there are any questions, comments, insights, anything at all that you'd like to share. And you can just unmute and call it out if you want to, or you can use the raised hand feature. Whatever works for you is going to work for me today. Anybody? Yes, Bev? You'll have to unmute. And if anybody wants to ask a question, please unmute in advance so you're ready to go. Go ahead, Bev.
Okay. Have you seen the Holocaust Museum?
In Washington, D.C.?
Yes.
Several times. I'm a charter member. I've chaperoned an 8th grade trip from California to DC, and we visited. I've also made numerous visits on my own, and I visited the records department where they were able to pull up some information giving me the dates on which my mother entered Auschwitz and left Auschwitz, etc. So yes, I'm a charter member and a big fan of that museum. And a supporter. A portion of the proceeds that I make from selling my mother's book do go to the education efforts at the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in D.C.
That's a wonderful place for everyone to visit.
It is indeed. Thank you for reminding us of that. Joan?
Joan, on a trip to the Holy Land with a former bishop of the Lutheran Church here. We went to Yad Vashem. It was one of the most stunning visits of any museum or structure I have ever been in, because of the mirror against mirror against mirror. You really can see and can get the conception of the millions of people.
Yeah.
In today's current undercurrent of anti-Semitism is so distressing. And so I really appreciate you. You're only one day off the big.
I know.
Day.
I know. One day off from the Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah.
Yad Vashem, and anyone. And we were quite safe. This was back about 2000, and there were armed people going through, and we never felt threatened. Now, not so much.
Right. Thank you, Joan. Any other questions? Prudence.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment and then I have a question. Comment was, I did go to Auschwitz, and I guess what impacted me a lot walking through where they lived, they had pictures of the people who died there along the wall. And I kept looking because it seemed like most of them only lived about 3 months at the most once they got to Auschwitz. And then my question was, growing up, I mean, I think it's typical World War II veterans too. A lot of them don't like to speak about their experience, but did you grow up around other Jewish neighborhood kids that their parents had been?
They weren't on my block. My block had a lot of large Catholic families with 10 kids, 9 kids. And so there was always kids to play with on the block, but they were not Jewish. But my parents had a social network of other survivors that they would gather with. And we, the kids, would be told, go play outside or go to another room. And our parents would socialize together. And about 5 years ago, I was invited. I now live in Southern Oregon, but I was invited to return to Oakland for a reunion of second generation Holocaust survivors like me. And we just kind of milled around the room. And we just talked to whoever we were next to, and then we go talk to somebody else. And then the hostess said, should we do this again next year? And we enthusiastically said, yes, let's do it again next year. So I approached the hostess and I said, next year, if we do this again, and I hope we will, could we sit in a circle for an hour or so and just talk about what was it like in each of our households? Did our parents talk to us about the Holocaust? Were our parents always bitter about it? What was the experience of growing up with parents who had survived the Holocaust? And she said, I would love to have that conversation, but I can't. And I said, what do you mean you can't? And she said, well, about a quarter of the people who came here today told me that if I try to organize any discussion, they won't come. And I said, why won't they come? And they said, Irv, she said, Irv, I got the impression that your parents enabled you to grow up in a pretty happy household. Some of these people grew up with parents that were so bitter that that bitterness was part of every interaction they had with anybody, including their own kids. And the kids do not want to revisit it. And so they said, if we try to organize a discussion and put them on the spot to talk about their household, they won't do it. They won't come. So we met again the next year, and we did not have any such discussion. And then there were none of these during the pandemic. And then this past year, they had another reunion, and I couldn't attend. And I talked to somebody, and she said, we finally did it. We sat in a circle and we talked. And so I missed it. But I had a Zoom conversation with a few of them and got some insights into what it was like in their household. So, but I feel so blessed that my parents, though they had every reason, I guess you could say every reason to be bitter, that wasn't passed down to me. And they really tried to turn the page and say, we're not going to be defined as victims. We're going to go on with our lives and make the best out of it that we can. Thank you, Prudence. Before we take a break, let me show you sort of the next little portion of my presentation. And I think that'll take us right up to the halfway point, and that would be a good time to break. So let me share again my screen with you. And again, it takes me a few seconds to switch over to it. So my main decision that I had to make as an editor was how was I going to organize the book? So first comes my foreword, and then my mother's handwritten essay, which I typed up so it's not in its handwritten form, Follow Me into Auschwitz, a biographical timeline of my mother's life. And then I go chronologically. First, the family is together, but they're in a ghetto. And then my mother is taken to Auschwitz. And then 3 stories that take place in the concentration camp. And then what it was like on the day that my mother is liberated. And then a story about going back to one's village, hoping that you find family members there, only to find you're not really welcome because there's a new family living in your house. And then my afterward, and then a few appendices at the back. So my mother's book has kind of served as a key, giving me access to go into schools and talk to students. I used to go into schools because I was a teacher, but my subject was mathematics. Now I have a new reason to go to schools. And when schools hear that I've published this book and that it is of interest to young adults and teens, it gives me access to go into schools. And I was speaking at a middle school in Medford, Oregon, near to where I live, about 2 years ago. And the teacher had read the book and said, I was so moved by the transcript of what your mother said at San Francisco State in 1971. I assume that transcript comes from a recording that you have. Would you play the recording itself for my students? And I explained that given the time that he was allowing me to talk to his students, playing that recording was going to eat up all the time that he was giving me. And so he said, well, will you just play part of it? So I created sort of a 9-minute distillation. These are excerpts from what my mother said in 1971. This is about 9 minutes long. You're going to hear her voice as it was recorded in 1971. Recording equipment back then was pretty primitive. And when you leave reel-to-reel tapes on your shelf for 50 years or 45 years, they don't get any better. And if anything, they degrade. So the quality is not as good as I wish it were. You're going to hear 9.5 minutes. I will mention that I recently, within the last 5 months, created an audio book of my mother's book. And rather than have somebody read what she said in 1971 and 1967, an hour of the audiobook is my mother's actual voice. So in about 5 seconds, you're going to hear about 9 minutes of that, and that'll take us up to break time.
So now if you follow me, we'll go together to the station, to the collecting station. And there you're being counted, and a train drives up to the siding, and you were marched up to the train, and it's a kettle train. And the doors are being locked from the outside and bolted, and the guards are mounting the platforms. And you are suddenly in a different world, in a train that's beginning to move, but has no windows, and it's full of people. And so you're surrounded by bodies and you jostle against each other and you fight for breath. And before you board the train, you're given a little loaf of bread, which kind of lulls your senses because you feel, well, if you were going to death, why the hell would they give you bread? So you clutch that little piece of bread and you don't know that it's going to have to last you for 3 days or whatever it will take them to get to your destination, and the destination is unknown. And there's a lot of speculation in the train going out as it moves through the countryside, and people are climbing on each other's shoulders to try to peek out and see where we're going or where you are going, because you are with me now. And nobody can tell, but there's a lot of speculation, and there's always an optimist that would say, well, they're going to put us to work. We've worked before, and maybe we'll work another few months, and the whole thing will be over, and we'll go back and start a normal life again. And then it's always the pessimist that said, no, they're going to kill us all. Nobody wanted to believe that. How can anybody think anything that monstrous? And why would anybody want to kill us? That was the question. And so the train glides and rolls through the night. You have to fight for your breath. You have to fight for space. There's no place to lie down, so you stand up. People that died overnight kind of are held up with the others, so there's a bit of room made in the corner for them. And finally you arrive at the destination, and this is the end of the line. And the train, it's early afternoon, and the doors of the train open, and you step out into a different world. It's unbelievable to you because there is nothing to keep your mind to hang it on, no peg, nothing in the past that would connect with any scene like this. At first there is a reception committee, they tell you to step off, and there is a voice from a loudspeaker telling you that you've come to your destination and this is a camp where you're going to work. And on the gates, there is a gate, an iron gate, and on the gate there is a legend which says, Arbeit macht frei, which translated into English means work sets you free. And it isn't until much later, after you've been there for a while, that you realize that the inscription should have said, abandon all hope ye who enter here. Well, you come down and there's a reception committee consisting of guards with guns and bayonets, big German Shepherd and Doberman dogs. You're surrounded. From the distance there is a band playing, and that makes it even more weird. You see a lot of wires, wire fences about 6 foot high, crisscrossing in every direction. And you're told to step out. You're told to leave all your belongings there. They will be delivered to you later. And you're also told that the older people and the children will have to go to a different part of the camp where they will be taken care of. And the young people will go to a work camp. And so you separate from your mother and your father, and you look at her and she's trying to tell you something, and you don't quite know whether to leave her or not, but then you're pushed by the others, and everything is, the orders come then in such rapid succession, and everything is quick that you don't have time to think, so you leave with the others, the young people. You look out and there are you see two big chimneys against the sky, tall chimneys with smoke and fire belching out of it day and night. And you begin to wonder, what is being burned there? Well, after all, you've been told that you're going to work, so perhaps this is a factory. And, well then, if it's factory, who's working there, and why don't they put us to work finally? They did put some people to work, and some people were just sitting there to wait, either to be, well, let's not jump ahead. We'll wait for, we don't know what. And somebody suggested that in this, that fire that you see burning is because they burn our hair there. They burn your papers, your photographs, anything. But they don't burn your mother there. And you know that they do, but you don't want to believe it. You can't believe it, because if you do, then you go insane. So you try to fool yourself that it's not so. Death was very cheap at Auschwitz. It was so easy to die. It took no heroism. Death looked at you from the barrels of the guns. It looked at you from the eyes of the examining doctor. It looked at you from the eyes of the people going towards those chimneys in big vans. It was everywhere. It stunk you way into your brain. But you couldn't accept that, otherwise you just can't function. And every hour lived at Auschwitz was a victory. The Nazis pretty nearly succeeded in bringing human beings to the level of animals. Pretty nearly. But there was that inner strength that you try to preserve, and you do tell yourself over and over again that it's they who are the animals and you are human. And there is that constant fight to preserve every bit of human feeling and not let them bring you down to this level. And when you're beaten, and you are beaten and kicked, you still think that it's he that's the animal. And you store things in your memory, and you say to each other, let's not ever forget any of it. Because if we do come out alive of this, if we do wake up from this insane nightmare, we have to bring the message to make sure that this thing will never happen again.
Now, as I mentioned, this shortened version of my mother's presentation was shown to a group of 7th graders, and I tacked on this picture at the end. I've told you this story not to weaken you, but to strengthen you. Now it is up to you, never again. And I tried to impress upon the students that there is so much hate in the world today. And I'm sure at the bottom level of this pyramid, some of this is going on their school playground, in their classes, where maybe there's stereotyping going on and insensitive remarks and rumors being spread about people. When that gets normalized, and we just say, oh, that's the way kids are, then it's likely to escalate to that green level where people are being avoided or ridiculed. There's name calling going on. People are being bullied, maybe racial slurs or religious slurs. And when that gets normalized and people graduate from school and are now in positions of authority in the workplace, or perhaps as landlords, they take whatever biases they've grown up with and then they apply them in decision making about who gets a job, who gets an apartment, who gets a loan, etc. And of course, course, that can escalate even further to bias-motivated violence. There's so much of that in the world. And then that can escalate to genocide. So I encourage students to take note of what they're seeing in their community, within their school, and try to do something about it, even at their young age. Maybe there's some small thing that they can do. And we as adults, I think we need to be aware of what we're seeing in our community, in our world, in the political discourse, et cetera, and just try to be forces for good in the world and not just let this keep escalating. And I try to let the students know that I was guilty of stereotyping. I stereotyped the entire German population as bad because of what they had done to my family. And then I finally did go to Germany. I was reluctant for many years, but I received encouragement to go see that the Germany of today is not the Germany of the 30s and 40s. So I went. Here you see a memorial in Berlin. It looks like a bunch of coffins. It's within walking distance of that glass domed building in the back. That's the Reichstag, which is like the equivalent of our US Capitol, the most important government building. And it's no surprise that it's made of glass. That is to indicate the transparency that the new German government wants. They want to be very transparent, and they want people to be reminded that there was a Holocaust. Of all the things they did with this city block, they could have turned it into a huge park and a beautiful park, but instead it's a rather stark memorial that looks like coffins. And the sign at the entrance says, "Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe." And everywhere I went in Germany, I saw reminders that there had been a Holocaust, and the German government telling people, we were responsible for this, and we as a nation must be sure and be vigilant to not let this happen again. It was very, very healing. And I had to let go of that stereotype. And I tell that to students just to try to get them to think about, are you holding on to some stereotype? And if so, is it time to let go of it, as I did? So let's break here. I'm going to just stop sharing, and I'm going to check the chat because I did see there's one comment in the chat. Oh, Carrie has said she just downloaded my mother's book from Audible. Well, thank you so much for that, Carrie. Yeah, the book is available as a paperback directly from me. That's Falabra Press. Onlyhopebook.com. It's available as a paperback from Amazon. It's available as a Kindle book from Amazon, and it's available on iTunes and Audible as an audiobook. So I don't mean this to just be a big sales pitch. I hope it's a learning experience for you, regardless of whether you buy the book or not. But I appreciate so much that somebody just purchased the audiobook. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I think you'll find it to be worth listening to. So it's about 6 minutes past the hour. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene at about 12 minutes past the hour. So enjoy your break time, chance to refresh, a chance to get something to drink, whatever works for you. And I'll see you at about 12 minutes past the hour. And if any of you have questions, I'll just stay put because I don't drink coffee after noon, and it's 2 minutes past noon here. So I'm done with coffee, and I can just stay put and respond to any questions you might have. Yes, Joan?
Well, I'm 91 going on 92, and I remember.
You hide those years well, Joan.
Thank you. It's fun doing that. And I remember Pearl Harbor attack, and I was that day as a 9-year-old. But I do have a story of bias. In high school, I was in New Jersey, and our junior class was assembled into to vote for people to go to girls' state. And all of the junior class was going to in boys' state. And at that time, I was using the last name Mansfield. My stepfather.
Just 1 second. Give me just 1 second. I accidentally hit play on something I didn't intend to. I didn't want to hear it at this point. So please continue where you left off. I got distracted.
Okay. I was using my stepfather's last name, Mansfield, who was a descendant of the Livingstons who signed the Constitution. He was originally from Iowa. But I was a busybody and was involved in journalism. And my best friends were Joan Birnbaum, Needle Sisselman, and Annette Kahn. Now, there was a lot of murmuring when those ballots went around to the class people. Afterwards, in the girls' bathroom, I was in a stall and I heard several of the girls saying, "Can you imagine? They want us to vote for 3 Jews and their girlfriend, and we really don't know about her because my last name ended in P." And so we were reassembled, not to have a learning moment, but because the faculty buckled and said, "We will vote again." And so I didn't get to go to Girls State. Why have I lived this long? Because I have several rules. Number 1, say something nice or do something nice for everybody every day. Try and balance your life and stay active. Don't bear grudges. They only stay with you like a boil that doesn't heal. Oh, and maybe an occasional, just a dash of bourbon and that. But it's because we've known people from the Second World War could not talk about the experiences. You must get rid of this and let that boil heal. Thank you for giving me the time.
You're welcome. This reminds me of somebody who went to my high school, but he was 2 years younger than me, and we weren't friends in high school. He contacted me about 6 months ago, and he said, "I have a story involving your mom that you'd probably like to hear because I know you published your mom's stories." He said, "When I was a teenager and you, Irving, had moved out of the house, your parents hired me to weed the garden. And I knew from my parents that your parents were Holocaust survivors. So he was weeding the garden. My mother came out to talk to him. And he said to my mother, 'You survived the Holocaust, right?' And my mother said, 'Yes, I did.' And he asked, 'Do you have one of those tattoos?' And she said, 'Yes, I do.' And she rolled up her sleeve and showed him the tattoo. And then he said to me that at the time, back in the early 1970s, he was watching a TV show called Combat, in which the US soldiers are fighting the Nazi soldiers. And of course, it's good guys and bad guys. And based on his experience of watching that show, he blurts out to my mother, 'I hate Germans.' And my mother put her hand on his shoulder and said, 'You need to let go of that hate. That hate is not going to do you or anybody else any good. And if you've learned a little bit about the Holocaust, then you should know that hate is what brought it all about. And you need to let go of the hate. You shouldn't be hating anybody.' And I loved hearing that story. I just absolutely loved hearing that story. Give me a moment here. I'm going to pull up the thing I want to show next in my PowerPoint here. I'm going to go a little bit out of order and show something that I just prepared today. Slideshow from the current slide.
Also, Irv, there's a question in
in the chat. Thank you, Thea. If your mother hadn't been sent to the other camp, would she have made it through at Auschwitz, do you think? No, I don't think she would have survived. As somebody mentioned, I think it was Prudence who said she had visited Auschwitz and she saw these mentions of how long people spent there, and 2 months, 3 months was a typical lifespan if you were at Auschwitz. I don't think she could have endured more months at Auschwitz than she did. So my hunch, and of course I have no way to prove this, but my hunch is that had she not been sent to Gross-Rosen and remained at Auschwitz, she probably would not have survived. That's my guess. So it is 12 minutes past the hour. I'll wait a few more seconds, just hoping that anybody who has their speaker on hears my voice and realizes it's time to come back to their computer. I want to now share some excerpts for you from the book. And usually the first excerpt that I share is from my mother's handwritten essay, Follow Me into Auschwitz. And I usually share about the last 3 pages of it. About the last 3 pages. But instead of me reading it to you as I normally would, you've heard my voice for an hour already. You're going to hear my voice again as we proceed. I'm going to play you this as it was read by the narrator of the audiobook. Okay, the audiobook is narrated by a professional narrator, a former actress for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. That's here in Ashland, Oregon, where I live. So she's a former actress. She's a voice coach. She teaches singing. She has narrated. She's an award-winning narrator. Her name is Christine Williams. And I'm going to play you the same paragraphs that I would usually read, but it's going to be in her voice. So give me just a moment here to share my screen. And this is from my mother's handwritten essay, Follow Me into Auschwitz. This is the first time I've ever played this for a group, and hopefully I've set it up properly and you will hear it.
What would you have done if it were your freedom and your life that were being threatened by the Nazis? What if it were your parents, your children, your brothers and sisters, and your dearest friends that were being taken away, never to be seen again? Would you have fought the Nazis with your bare hands? Would you have chosen to die by your own hand rather than let yourself be driven to the gas chambers? Accusations have been made that Jews behaved cowardly and let themselves be slaughtered by the millions without resistance. This is not true. There was resistance, not only desperate, armed, and heroic, as in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, but day-to-day resistance and a will to withstand, to outlive. Death was cheap at Auschwitz. It was ever present, stinking its way into your very brain, blackening the sky with its smoke, looking at you from the barrels of guns and from the eyes of the condemned. Death was with you during the dreaded roll calls, where at dawn and dusk you stood for endless hours in ankle-deep mud, with only rags between you and the biting chill of the wind. It was easy to die at Auschwitz. One did not have to be a hero to die. There were many ways you could have saved the SS the work. All you had to do was give up. Give up willingly the spark of life still flickering in you, that last thing you had, which they were so determined to take. You could have risked your own life and tried to attack an SS guard, as has been suggested by Dr. Bruno Bettelheim in his book, The Informed Heart. This, even if it were possible, would have been not only a foolish way to commit suicide, but it would have been murder as well. For by your so-called heroism, you would have exposed your next of kin, your loved ones, and the rest of your fellow inmates to the uncontrollable fury of SS revenge. It was easier to just touch the electrified wires crisscrossing the campsite and end it all. The temptation was always there. It was hardest to resist at night. The wires stretched as far as you could see, with the lights strung on them, and the wind playing a weird invitation to death. Touch me. Come close. Touch me. It took great strength to resist, but we resisted. I resisted the temptation. Dying makes sense if one has a cause to die for. We had no such cause. We had a great cause to live. By my own death, I could not possibly have saved anybody nor accomplished anything. It would have been a futile gesture and an easy way out. And it would have proved that deep in my heart, I believed that Auschwitz is forever. It would have meant admitting to myself that this screaming, insane world around me represented the universe. I chose to live, for every hour lived at Auschwitz was a victory. And if I had lost in the end, I would be marching to meet death along with the others, without tears, without dramatic outbursts, but in a silence that shrieked its mute protest into the unheeding heavens and a deaf world. The world was not prepared for Auschwitz. It was, in fact, a place unbelievable even for its inmates. No words can really adequately describe this weird world, unlike anything mankind had ever known. In order to understand its implication, you actually had to be part of it. I'll have to be autobiographical, But follow me, if you will, into Auschwitz and spend a day there and meet some of the people in the nameless mass of bodies. Try, if you will, to feel even for a moment that you could have been one of them, that in fact you were one of them.
And there you have the last several paragraphs of my mother's handwritten essay, the one that had words crossed out and other words written in. I consider it masterful. And I would say that even if it wasn't my mother's writing, and especially when you consider how the short period of time she'd been in this country and her short exposure to this new language, English, that most of us probably grew up as our first and perhaps only language. I see that something else has come in chat, so let me see what that is. Are you familiar with the books written by Patrick Hicks, Across the Lake, a novel of the Holocaust and Ravensbrück? I am not, so I'm going to, I guess when the meeting is over, I'll just try to copy the chat and have a reference to it. I always am looking for recommendations of books, films, and the like. And along those lines, I'll mention that for my own Ollie, here at Southern Oregon University, I teach a 4-week class about my mother's book. And for that class, I have prepared a resource list of films with little asterisks next to the ones I've actually seen and others that have been recommended to me, and books with little asterisks next to the ones that I've actually read and others that have been recommended to me. And I'm happy to provide that resource list to any of you if you would like it. If you go to the website, onlyhopebook.com, there is a contact link. Let me see if I can bring that up. Here we go. This is the website for the book. And we're looking now at the front page or the home page, and there are testimonial comments. There's ways that you can purchase the book through the website. There are excerpts from the foreword, other excerpts from various stories. There are excerpts from what you just heard, Follow Me into Auschwitz. Concert at Auschwitz is that story that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle. So there's a portion of that story there. There are various video links in case you want to see other presentations that I've given that were recorded. There are audio recordings of me being interviewed on the radio and other presentations for which only audio exists. And then there's this contact link that you could let me know you have a question, a comment, another group that you want to put me in touch with who might appreciate a presentation like this one. I'm always looking to find new audiences with which to share. So please let me know and share any constructive criticisms you have or anything else. If you purchase the book and have a reaction to something that you read, I would love to hear from you. And lastly, this is a new addition to the website, information about this newly published audiobook. And as you can see in the bullet points near the top, there are 3 voices heard in the audiobook. There is my mother's own voice for about an hour, speaking to audiences at San Francisco State. I read my own forward and afterward, and then Christine Williams, as I mentioned, former Oregon Shakespeare Festival actress and award winner for Best Narration, reading my mother's story. So enough of a sales pitch. Let's go back to stopping sharing and seeing if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Okay, well then I'll pick up the book and I'll share something else with you then. Let me read to you a portion of my foreword. My foreword begins like this. My mother wrote, my father spit. My mother talked, my father spit. My mother told her stories to anyone who would listen. My father spit. My mother wanted to share her Holocaust experiences with you, and she did so by writing the stories that you hold in your hand. My father kept his own experiences locked up tight within himself, and then he spit. Both of them were deeply affected by what they suffered in their teens and 20s. It is baffling to me how they were able to live what those around them, those who didn't know any better, would call normal lives. My mother's way of processing and integrating her experiences was to get close to people and then share her deepest secrets, letting them feel her pain. My father kept his pain locked up within almost until the end of his life. Shortly after my mother's death, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I tried caring for him at home. He had always enjoyed stamp collecting, and someone had given him a bag of European stamps from the 30s and 40s. He hardly ever talked at this point, but he was very content to examine and sort the stamps. One night he was looking over his stamps one by one as I graded papers. All of a sudden he became quite agitated. Looking in his direction, I saw the one in his hand bearing a picture of Hitler, and if I remember correctly, a swastika. Without saying a word, my father angrily spit on that stamp. My father did not, as a rule, call attention to himself, and I had never seen him spit. He was also not one to ask others to focus on what he endured and lost as a young adult. He might have fooled those who knew him into thinking that his experiences of the Holocaust were behind him or forgotten. In that moment, however, his spitting left no doubt that his grief and anger had always been there, hidden. Witnessing that, I could tell that his stories were every bit as powerful as my mother's, if only he had chosen or been able to share them. So they handled their grief in such different ways. My mother was outspoken and she's writing, and my father's just keeping it all within until he has Alzheimer's disease. And then he spits on this stamp with Hitler's picture on it, which caught me totally off guard and made such an impression on me because it was so out of character for my father. I want to read you a little bit, another excerpt from my foreword so that you'll have a sense of where this title came from, Only Hope. So that will be revealed in the next few paragraphs. As I think about my parents' experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, I wonder what kept them going. With too little food, death all around them, savage beatings doled out to those not doing their assigned slave labor quickly enough, and the loss of all that had once been dear to them, what could they do to summon the will to live another day? The only answer that comes to me is they could hope. With shattered dreams, interrupted education, no homes or family to which they might someday return, and a horrifying day-to-day existence, they could not make plans for their futures. They could only hope. Would each day's meager food ration provide enough sustenance to stay alive until tomorrow? Would the doctor making the selections of who should live and who should die allow them another day's salvation? If yesterday they were lucky to avoid being singled out by a capricious and malicious guard, would that luck last through another day? They could only hope. Would the torn rags that had to suffice as clothing provide enough warmth at night to avoid freezing to death? Would the diseases that ran rampant throughout the camps, taking many lives, spare theirs? They could only hope. My mother, Felicia Lubliner, died in 1974, but she lives on in the pages you are about to read. She also lives on in the hearts and minds of the many people who have read and been impacted by her stories. You are about to enter her world, and I am confident you will be grateful that you decided to go there. And that is my way of welcoming you to what you're about to read if you do read the book. So I want to share another excerpt with you, and you're going to probably be upset with me for reading part of a story and not finishing it, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a sense of one of her stories, and I'm not going to read it all the way to the end. This story is called Concert at Auschwitz. It is the one that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1961. I still have that newspaper from 1961 in which her story appears, and the story is called Concert at Auschwitz. In this story, my mother uses the German word Leader. Actually, the word leader shows up twice. The first time in English, referring to the leader of a group, The second time, I'll try to pronounce it with a German pronunciation as best I can. And the word Lied is a kind of folk song associated with the Romantic period, and Lieder is the plural of that. So when you hear Lieder, we're talking about a kind of folk song associated with the Romantic period. This is Concert at Auschwitz, or at least the beginning of Concert at Auschwitz. I was sent to Auschwitz late in 1944 when the war in Europe was already 5 years old. For us, the Jewish people in Poland, those were long, terror-filled years when I learned the paralyzing effect of fear, when my healthy young appetite was replaced by hunger that kept me awake at night, gnawing inside like a worm, and when the only defense against humiliation was our contempt for the tormentors. I was already then a veteran of 2 ghettos and had lost trace of my father and 2 sisters who were sent away and never heard from again. I thought I had seen and lived through the worst. Then I came to Auschwitz. I remember every day and everything that occurred, but some things, fragments and pictures, stand out more sharply in focus. One of them is this unbelievable picture of my first day in Auschwitz. There I was, dressed in pitiful rags, thrown to me at random after my clothes had been taken away, barefoot with no undergarments. My freshly shaven head was naked and shamefully exposed. I was sobbing in despair. I was separated from my mother when we came off the train. I did not know then what was happening to her, that she was being led to the gas chambers to die. I longed to be with her. She looked so forlorn and frightened as we were forced apart. Cry, cry, little one, whispered someone in my ear. It is good for you. I too cried when I first came here. We all did, but we have no more tears left. Look around and see for yourself. I raised my head and looked at what seemed to be only a blur of faces and a multitude of people surrounding me, all packed so close together there was no room to move about. It was quiet except for an occasional moan, sigh, cough, or whisper. How long have you been here? I asked my new friend. I don't know exactly, she answered. It has been such a long time. Maybe a month? We lose all track of time here. We just wait. Wait for what? I asked. Wait to be free. We will be free someday. We must believe this, she said. Or else. She did not finish her sentence, for suddenly a large door was thrown wide open, and a burst of bright daylight almost blinded me. There was considerable commotion, and orders shouted. My heart stood still with fear. When I dared to look up again, a few women were standing in the doorway, listening attentively to orders being given by the head of the group. This leader was a young woman in an SS uniform with a culotte skirt and riding boots. In one of her white-gloved hands, she carried a riding crop. The other rested on her hip, where she wore a holster and pistol. My friend whispered to me, she is Irma Gressa. We call her the angel of death. Don't move now. Don't let her notice you or single you out. And if you were reading the book at this point, you would see a picture of Irma Gressa, who was found after the war, put on trial for war crimes at age 22, the same age as my mother. When she was liberated, she was 22. Irma Gressa was executed for numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity. She was infamous for her brutality. So picking up where I left off, my friend whispered to me, she is Irma Gressa. We call her the angel of death. Don't move now. Don't let her notice you or single you out. As it turned out, this particular morning, Irma Gressa was in a mood to be entertained and wanted music. She had heard that among this group was a former star of the Warsaw Opera and wanted to hear her sing. A young woman was ordered out of the crowd of inmates. She still showed traces of beauty on her emaciated face, in spite of her shaven head. Her naked body could be seen through the holes of her tattered garment. As she began to sing, Irma Gressa stood quietly, listening to the beautiful arias, Lieder, and folk songs which poured forth in an uninterrupted stream. The young woman sang of love, beauty, and peaceful nature, while outside the smokestacks of the crematoria billowed clouds of fire and smoke, which covered the sky for miles. And I'm going to stop there. But my mother juxtaposes the beauty of this music being sung by an opera singer and the effect that it has on people who are hearing this beautiful music, while around them are just so many reminders of death. There's smoke billowing from the chimneys of the crematoria. There's just the constant reminder that at any moment somebody might act out of line, and then it's going to be the punishment of many for the deeds of one. You could lose your life not because you did something wrong, but because somebody near you did something wrong, and you're going to be paying the price for it as well. So it's a juxtaposition of the beauty and the ugliness of Auschwitz, and the hope among the prisoners that it has a softening effect on Irma Gressa, the guard, and we come to learn how it affected the inmates and how it affects Irma Gressa and what takes place afterwards. So that is my mother's story that was printed in the San Francisco Chronicle. I do see there's a little bit more that has come in the chat. So I'm going to remove the spotlight on me so I can see more of your faces and see what has come in. Somebody says, you're a good storyteller and writer too. Well, I appreciate that, Bev. Thank you so much. And Deborah says, very interesting, horrific, and hopeful. A number of people have made comments, testimonial comments about that hopeful quality of the book. A number of people have said, when I read the book, I really thought it was going to be depressing because the Holocaust was such a sad period in history, but the book gives me such hope. Your mother's spirit comes through as such a survivor and somebody who was not willing to be defined by that experience. And so one person wrote, and she lives in California, and when she wrote this, the pandemic was keeping everybody inside and masked and such, and also there were forest fires burning in California at the time, which was causing everybody to just be coughing because of the smoke and such. And she said, these are such troubled times. We have COVID, we have the smoke, and we have the political rancor going on in this country, and yet reading this book gives me hope. And a number of people have alluded to the book as a book that really does convey hope and better things ahead for mankind. So I appreciate that comment came in just now. Are there any other questions? You don't have to necessarily type it in chat, just questions, insights, anything you might have to offer. And before I pick up the book and read you a bit more.
I was just going to say that, how the Nazis dehumanized the Jewish people and all these people, but they also dehumanized their own people. They got them to do things that I don't think these people, a lot of them would have thought they would have ever done. But
I think you're quite right.
Created that, and it just is crazy to think of that being able to happen. But I think we do have to know that it could happen anywhere.
Indeed.
Don't speak out.
Indeed, indeed. And when you have this culture, I mean, I've seen documentaries of where Hitler might be addressing a huge crowd and everybody's expected to give the Heil Hitler salute. And if you didn't do it and you got reported, you were going to be treated just like the people who were being treated the worst. And so you had no choice but to just kind of act in accordance with what was expected of you, and so much fear that if I don't do the right thing here, I'm going to be treated just like these other people. So I'm just going to fall into line and not let it happen. I went to the Holocaust Museum in Dallas, Texas, and they had this triangle, and in the middle it said victims, and it said when you see somebody being victimized, you have to choose one of the three corners of the triangle. In one of them you had perpetrators. You could choose to join the perpetrators, and I try to impress upon students when I speak to them that the perpetrator is going to encourage you, come join us in being just as hateful as we are. I hope that they won't make that choice. Second group is the bystanders, the people who say, this isn't my problem, I'm just going to turn away and pretend I don't even see it.
Mhm.
And then the third group are the people who act as rescuers or upstanders, and they try to do something about it. Even if it's a
Mhm.
small something, maybe there's something that can be done. And so,
Mhm.
Prudence, as you mentioned, the Germans managed to get their people to just fall into line and either be bystanders and say, whatever you do is fine with me, I'm not part of it, or in the worst cases, get involved in helping to make the most horrific things happen. And it's not just the German people, but similar things went on in Poland, where the
Mhm.
Polish people were recruited to
Yeah.
be part of it, in Lithuania, in other countries. I have visited memorials to the murdered Jews of Lithuania, and
Mhm.
and it's very well documented that in many cases people just stepped forward and said, we'll volunteer to be a part of this. Better to be a part of it than to be in opposition to the party that has taken over.
But I
So
do think it's important what you said too about the Germans acknowledging. Unlike, I always say, the Japanese have never really acknowledged, but the Germans, I have German friends that are my age or a little older, and they said, you know, when they were in school then, they were taught war is wrong.
yeah,
And they, you know, still today, when I went to Auschwitz, there were groups of German school children going through there. So they're putting it, they're not hiding behind it.
right. The only concentration camp I have visited thus far is Dachau, but just as you mentioned, I saw school groups going through there,
Mhm.
and it's required as part of a youth's education in Germany to
Mhm.
learn about the Holocaust. One thing that really pleased me was when I was in Berlin, I went to a government tourist agency and I picked up a brochure that said, if you have a week in this area, spend 4 days in Berlin and then go spend the other 3 in the suburbs seeing other things. If you only have 3 days, concentrate your time here in Berlin, and here are the things to see. And if you only have one day, here are the highlights you must not miss. And one of those highlights was the Jewish Museum. And you
Hmm.
can't visit the Jewish Museum without getting a healthy dose of Holocaust education. And they want people to have that experience as a highlight. And this is the government putting that out for people. It was just so healing for me to go have that experience. And my wife and I have booked a trip with a World War II scholar. We're going to do it in September of 2025. The name of the tour is The Rise and Fall of Hitler. And it starts in Berlin and ends up in Warsaw. And it does include a visit to Auschwitz. And so finally, I will realize this dream I've had for many years. And I know it will be painful and emotional for me, but I need to do it, that I'll be going to Auschwitz next September. Um, I had a really cute moment in a middle school I spoke in about 2 weeks ago, where one of the teachers said, "Have you ever been to Auschwitz?" And I said, "No, but I'm going in September of 2025." And then one of the seventh graders raises her hand, and I call on her and I say, "Yes." And she said, "You mentioned September, and my older sister's getting married in September." I thought, well, that's nice. Let's keep to our topic, shall we? And I tried to put that nicely, but it just seemed so in keeping with kind of that seventh grade immaturity and what she wanted to share. Bev, I saw your hand go up. Go ahead. You need to unmute. No, you're still muted.
Closed it out, yes. Being a third generation American German with a maiden name of Zeidler, I always, as a young elementary student, felt guilty being German. And it's taken me a long time to try to get over it. But, you know, I think a lot of people have that guilt with their nationality,
Yeah,
even though they had absolutely nothing to do with it. And my
right.
grandfather immigrated from Lodz, Poland. I thought that interesting, but that was probably in the 1900s.
Uh-huh. Um, my mother describes a different kind of guilt, that she felt guilty that she was the one survivor of such a large family and had to wonder, why me? Did I not do enough to keep them alive? Um, so it's heartbreaking, the number of people who suffered and the number of people who carried forward guilt that they really did not have any reason to feel, but it was natural, and perhaps people were reinforcing it and making you feel that way. And but I appreciate you sharing that, Bev. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, let me mention to you that when I do visit schools, and I do a lot of visits to schools, I always keep my eye on the clock. And when there's about 2 minutes left, I say to the students, I have shared with you things that are very relevant to my family. But let's kind of turn our focus to your family. If you're fortunate enough to live with one or two parents, and not everybody is, you probably know what those parents do for a living. But is that what they wanted to do for a living when they were your age? Because life has a way of imposing changes on us. Some of them forced upon us in a bad way. Some of them might be delightful changes. I mean, you might have to take care of a loved one who is ill, and thus you can't get the training or college education you had hoped for. And so all of a sudden you find yourself on a new path rather than the one you wanted. Maybe you can't afford to get the education that would have helped you achieve a goal. Maybe you do attend college and you find that you thought you were going to study A, but B is much more interesting. So you shift gears and you go in that new direction. And it turns out to be delightful, but it's not what you planned originally. Life throws curveballs at us. And just because you know what your parents do for a living doesn't mean you really know what your parents' ultimate goals were when they were your age. And I don't want you to follow in my footsteps and wait too long to have those conversations. And I'm not just talking about your parents, I'm talking about your grandparents, I'm talking about your uncles, I'm talking about your aunts. The elders in your family, don't wait too long to have a conversation with them. And there will come a time when it's too late. I can speak from experience. There will come a time when it's too late. So don't let that happen. And I put that into my afterword. Earlier I read you a portion of my foreword. I'm going to read you a portion of my afterword. It's broken up into 3 parts. The first part is prefaced with the 4 words, don't ask, don't tell. And it goes like this. These words, don't ask, don't tell, seem applicable to a set of unspoken rules that existed in my household as I was growing up. Wanting me to have a normal life, to think of myself as someone with unlimited potential and not a victim, and to enjoy the freedom gained by emigrating to the United States, my parents focused on the here and now, not delving into their past when speaking to me. This meant not talking about the family members they had lost, which included my grandparents, uncles, and aunts. The names of these people were not spoken in our household, and as a result, I know almost nothing about them. I wish I could help you, the reader, get to know my mother, but I feel as if I hardly know her myself. She passed away 50 years ago, and my memories have faded with time. She tried so hard to give me a normal upbringing, to shelter me from anything that would resemble her own shattered childhood. I think she was waiting until I was older, more mature, and curious to learn about her younger years, my deceased relatives, and what she endured in the camps. Had she lived longer, I'd have eventually reached that point, but this was not to be. When my mother died, there were so many questions left unanswered. I wonder why I never asked them. Is it because I, a rebellious teenager, was trying to keep my distance from her? Is it because I was too self-absorbed to ask my mother to tell me about her Holocaust experiences? Is it because I knew on some deep level that getting her to talk about those ordeals would dredge up horrific memories and trigger pain? Looking back, I think that all those things played a part in my not speaking up, asking the many questions I would ask if she were alive today. The next part of my afterword is prefaced with the 4 words, do ask, do tell. And I encourage people to have intergenerational conversations. For 3 years, I served on the board of directors of my local OLLI program, and I was a task force of 1 called the Intergenerational Conversations Task Force or something like that. But I was trying to get more intergenerational dialogue going between the OLLI members and the students at Southern Oregon University. And so we were really trying to facilitate more conversations, more opportunities to have older people attend classes with the young, and young people attend classes with the old. And that's a theme that's really dear to my heart, these intergenerational conversations. And one of the things that really makes my day, and it doesn't happen often, but it does happen, is I might be walking down the street here where I live, and I hear behind me, "Hey, professor." And I turn around and somebody says, "You spoke to my English class last year and you shared your mom's stories, and you also encouraged us to talk to our grandparents." I did that. I took you up on your suggestion, and I asked my grandparents a bunch of questions, and then they asked me a bunch of questions about my life, and we had really great conversations. So thank you for making that suggestion. Oh man, that makes my day when I have that happen. I've also had situations where a teacher will tell the students, "I want you all to write a paragraph or two to thank our guest speaker." And then in these letters, sometimes students mention, "Oh, I remember that he said we should talk to our parents and grandparents. I followed through on that." Oh, it just warms my heart when that happens. I get so excited. The third part of my afterword is just a personal statement about what it means to me to put this out to the world. And I'm going to read you the last few paragraphs, a little bit of which duplicates something I shared with you earlier. A few weeks before she died, my mother recorded some of her innermost thoughts on a cassette tape, most of which were about her fears of death. I recently played that recording and heard her say to me, "I'm afraid of nothingness. I'm afraid of not being, not being. What am I going to leave behind? How long will I be remembered? How long? For as long as one is remembered, one is not dead. I believe that. You can live in people's minds, memories, and hearts. I believe that." As I heard those words, I was reminded of a letter that I received from a high school student with whom I had shared my mother's writing. This student wrote, "Keep doing what you're doing. When you share her stories, you will not only be honoring your mother, but you will change so many different lives. By guiding her writing into your hands, I have faith that my mother will live on in your mind, your memory, and your heart as she does in mine. May this book serve as a fitting tribute to her indomitable spirit and resilience. That is my only hope. I miss you, Mom." So we're going to wind things up here. I'm going to play you my mother's voice one more time. Oh, let me check chat again, because there seem to be a few more comments that came in. One question is, how old were my parents when they entered the camps? So let me refer to the biographical timeline that appears in the book so I get this right. So my mother was deported to Auschwitz. Well, first the ghetto in 1942, and in 1940, no, I take it all back. 1939, her family is forced into the Pabianice ghetto. That's November of 39. She was born in November, so she would have just turned 17. Then she is relocated to the Lodz ghetto in May of 1942, so she would have been 19. Then in August of 44, she would have been 21. She's deported to Auschwitz. She spends August, September, October, 3 months in Auschwitz. But remember, every day you survived there was like a victory. It was the life expectancy, I think, was only 2 months. She is sent to Halbstadt, a subcamp of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp, in October of 44. This would be shortly before her 22nd birthday. And in May of 1945, she is 22 when she is liberated from the concentration camp and forced labor. My father's experience would be similar, but he was 2 years older than she was. It's also asked, how many years did each of them spend in the camps, and how old were they when they came to the US? I hope that timeline gave you some sense of how much time they spent in the camps. Longer in the ghettos than in the camps, but ghetto life was horrible, absolutely horrible. I've read so much about the Lodz ghetto and just what a nightmare it was to live there. and just how cruel the Germans, who were kind of the enforcers there, how cruel they were. Including one story I read recently of them going up to the second floor hospital ward, which was the maternity ward, and taking babies and just flinging them out the window. Things like that going on in the Lodz ghetto, just a terrible, terrible place. How old were they when they came to the US? They came to the US in 1949. My mother would have been 26, turning 27 later in 1949, and my father would have been 27. No, my father would have been 29 when he came. He was born in 1920. So there's my best attempt to answer that question. Dawn, please, what is your question?
It's actually an experience I want to share with you and the others. About 30 years ago, I was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. with a youth group from my church.
Yes.
And I was standing at the counter, and there was an older gentleman behind the counter, and a couple, a man and a woman, walked up to the counter and started screaming, and chaos just became happening. Security removed the older man and removed those people. And later they came over and told me that the couple were deniers, accusing him that it was fake. I just share that story every time I can, because I want everybody to realize we all have a responsibility to make sure that that is not happening.
Thank you, Dawn, for that's a good reminder. I was speaking in a community that's kind of known as being a hotbed for sort of neo-Nazi action, and I was really nervous speaking in the library there, and I had asked for a police presence, which they provided to me. And so when I started my presentation, I was really taken by this one rather old woman sitting in the front row who almost immediately, when I started talking, started crying. And I said, "I'm sorry that this is so impacting on you. Are you okay?" And she turns around, because she's in the front row, she turns around to the rest of the audience and in her accent says, "I survived the Holocaust. And if any of you have doubts that this happened, it's just like he's describing it." I showed that list of the things that Jews endured. And I think at that point, that's when she started to cry. And she said, "If any of you have doubts that this happened, I lived through it. And it happened just the way he's telling you. So don't try to be a denier here." And I couldn't have planned that any better than to have her in my audience. I've only had a Holocaust denier in my audience once. That was here in Ashland, Oregon, where I live. And I had somebody get up and challenge me when I was finished with my presentation. And he had a book in his hand and he said, "My question is, why do you waste people's time with your book, which is just filled with lies? This is the book people should be reading." And he held up his book and just said, "Your mother's book is filled with lies. Why do you waste our time?" I looked right at him and I said, "You've made a decision to ignore a tremendous amount of evidence. And just like you, I have to decide what I'm going to ignore. Does anybody else have a question?" And that was it. I just figured there's no point in debating with him. Other people want to hear me talk about my mother's experience and they don't want to hear me argue with him. So just leave him behind. And that's what I did. That's the only time I've been in the presence of a Holocaust denier, to my knowledge. I'm going to end with my mother's voice one more time from 1967, and I hope you'll stay with me. This might go 2 or 3 minutes beyond the hour, but I think it's a fitting end to my presentation, and I hope you'll stay put for it. So this is from 1967, so this is even 4 years older than the previous recording. Think 4 years even more primitive in terms of recording techniques. We were able to clean this up a little bit for the audiobook, but still the quality does leave something to be desired. These are the last few minutes of my mother's presentation to this audience before she started taking questions from them. I'm going to start reading it myself, but at a certain point I'll go silent and let my mother's voice take over. How would you feel in this unreal world? Could you imagine? It is not really real. It doesn't happen. It couldn't be happening. You sometimes think it's a different planet, that it isn't really you that's there. And then there is a final selection. You never know which way to run because one selection will take away the young people and one selection will take away the middle-aged people. The one will take away the ones that look still have a little flesh on your bones, and the other selection will come and take the real skeleton-like people. So you don't know who they're going to pick and in which group to find shelter. So you rub a little brick dust into your cheeks to look healthier. Perhaps you'll pass. There will be another day. And by tomorrow, the war might be over. You march in front of the doctor. The band is playing. He is whistling a tune. You pass in front of him. He looks at you. You're naked, of course. With a wave of his hand, he decides your fate. Rechts, links, right, left. Not until the vans come and take away a group do you really know which group is going where and where you are going to go. Then we watch the vans going away, packed with bodies, and you see eyes, hundreds of eyes, looking at you silently, moving away. What is the message? You see people from the vans taking off their shoes, that's if they manage to have any, to throw them back to the ones that were left. They won't be needing them anymore. And then you fight for those shoes to get them, if you're left.
So it's a struggle. But if you had preserved one spark of your identity, of what you were, of wanted to be, you have won. Dead or alive, you have won. And then if you're lucky, although at that time you don't think you're lucky, you don't know it, you survive the war, you find yourself alone, friendless, with no home, nothing to go back to. And again, you dare not yet think of future, so you think of the past. Now you think of the immediate past, you're filled with bitterness, you're filled with hate for everything, to the world that allowed this to happen. You hate yourself for having stayed alive while the others are dead. You think of the things you might have done, perhaps. Could you have put a little more of the brick dust on your little sister? Perhaps it would help her. Perhaps she too would pass this election. You think of these things. You think of revenge. You think a lot of revenge. And you also think of filling your belly, of having enough to eat, of having clothes, and a toothbrush. And you have to make choices again. Are you going to go through your life without having learned anything? Are you going to turn out to be a bitter, hateful person? Or are you going to turn your mind and try to see the world and yourself objectively and try to act and build a life that you think might be of some credit to you? You also think it might be of some credit to those that were not here to watch it. You learn, most of all, that human spirit is unconquerable. And if you had learned that, you somehow feel that perhaps you staying alive was worth all this. Thank you.
And with that, my mother thanked her audience. And for most of the presentations I've done over the last few years, this is where I stopped and thanked my audience. But there's one more thing that I want to share and that I've been sharing recently. And that is that I mentioned to you that my mother appears for 2 seconds in an Academy Award-winning movie, The Long Way Home. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think a moving picture is worth even more. So I'm going to hit play and let you see the 2 seconds in which my mother blinks in The Long Way Home. That's a precious 2 seconds for me. And also precious is the time that I've gotten to spend with you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share with you words that my mother wanted to share with all of us. And I hope this was time well spent for you. Thank you, Thea, for inviting me to share with your OLLI program for the 3rd time. I so appreciate it. I see there's questions in chat and I will respond to them, and I'll stay on if anybody else has questions. Again, I'll mention that I can be reached through the website onlyhopebook.com. onlyhopebook.com. Just run those 3 words together, and that contact link. Some people start their messages with, I'm trying to reach Irv. Well, Irv's the only person who sees these messages. They come directly to me. So you can just share whatever question you have. Or as I said, if you know of other groups that would appreciate a presentation like this one, and you think a dozen or more people would gather to hear it, I would love to do other Zoom presentations like this one. I'm going to go into the chat now and just see if there are other questions. I see a thank you. I see a thank you. I see a thank you and a compliment. Somebody mentions my mom was a real mensch. That's a Yiddish word for a good person. And indeed, she was a good person. And thank you, thank you, thank you for all those kind messages and for your kind attention. So have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your afternoon and a good evening. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you.
Thank you, Irv. Thank you so much. Good to see you again, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, I'll be coming through Sioux Falls in June, and I look forward to seeing you, Thea, in person.
Same. Thank you.
Bye-bye.